Humble pranams at Bhagwan's lotus feet. Loving Sai Ram and greetings from Prashanti Nilayam. Last time I narrated the events associated with the period 1945 to 1950, and it was during this period that Swami made the move or transition from the Patha Mandiram to the new Mandiram, which later came to be called Prashanti Nilayam. This was a major transition because later the new mandir became the command headquarters for Swami's mission, and it remained so till he withdrew. The mission of Swami, however, continues. It has to. And for that reason, Prashanti Nilayam continues to remain the center of gravity as far as Swami's missions are concerned. The present talk is the 9th in the series, and in normal course, I should be speaking to you today about how Swami settled down in the new mandir, how it grew, how more and more people began to flock to Swami, etc. That's an important segment of the story and cannot be missed on any account. But I'm going to spring a surprise because today I'm going to take a short break and fill you in on some important background that is hardly ever mentioned. To put it differently, I'm going to give you a rapid-fire history of India, particularly the British period. I am doing this so that you can have a better idea of the conditions under which Swami spent his early years. Those circumstances, in my opinion, had a great bearing on what Swami did later. With that preamble, let me get started on what press people would refer to as deep background. Okay, today the world sees India as a giant waking up from a long slumber and in a tearing hurry to catch up with the more advanced countries. In a sense, this widely held view has elements of truth in it. India does seem to be in a hurry to advance, develop, and so on. More explicitly, India is fairly strong in IT or information technology. It's able to build its own nuclear power plants, and I can personally testify to that. It can build rockets and launch them. It can launch even satellites all the way to the geostationary orbit or send them to the moon. All these are quite significant achievements. But if you go back to 1926 when Swami took birth, India was almost entirely a rural country, except for a few touches of modernity at the fringes, namely in a handful of towns and the capital cities of the large provinces. I should clarify, when I talk of India in 1926, I am in one breath talking of today's Pakistan, today's India, and today's Bangladesh. Of course, the British did not control all of it in the sense that they ruled only some provinces and certain sections, but while the other portions were under princes, the British had control. So notionally, the British were the masters of the whole of the peninsula and north of it, in the sense I defined earlier. Since India was very backward at that time, it's important to have some idea of the ambience in which Swami grew up as a boy and as a young person, so that his missions of compassion that he undertook in later years can be placed in the proper context and appreciated better. I know that some of you might be impatient with such a digression and argue, this is the story of God. He can do anything. Why bother about history? We want his story. I know that. I also agree that Swami is an avatar and he can do anything. But then, if you go back, all the later avatars from Rama onwards came with a human form and lived by and large as humans do. In fact, I have seen Swami repeatedly stress the human aspect of the avatar. And it is to convince us that he was as much human in terms of the body that Swami allowed, for example, fractures to occur to him. Let me recall one incident just to substantiate this. I am not going to talk about fractures, but I am going to recall an incident which happened when I was the Vice Chancellor. One day, Swami called me into the interview room to give some instructions. When I went in, I saw that one nail in one foot was black. Normally, Swami's robe always comes down to the ground level, and it's not always possible to see the foot and the nails in particular. That day I could, and I asked, Swami, what happened? Swami coolly replied, Oh, I hurt my foot while crossing the doorstep. The nail is black because of a blood clot. I was taken aback. I did not believe at that time that little mishaps like what happens to us could also happen to Swami. Hesitantly I said, Swami, it must be very painful. Swami looked at me coolly and replied, Of course, how else do you think it would be? I suddenly realized that the following day was Vinayaka Chaturthi and that when Swami came for darshan walking, back then he used to come walking, devotees would fall on him to have Pad Namaskar. Even though Sevadals would say, no, you shouldn't do it, devotees have their own way of pushing themselves and ignoring even commands from Swami. Now, if devotees did that, then it would be very painful for Swami. And I know that Swami will not stop them. So something had to be done. So I told Swami, can I arrange for word to be spread that tomorrow when you give darshan in the morning, devotees should avoid grabbing your feet as they normally do? Instantly Swami became angry and scolded me. Injuries happen to all, and they happen to me also. That comes along with the human form. However, hurt and pain are not going to prevent me from giving joy to devotees. So you better mind your business and leave this to me. Nobody comes between me and my devotees. That was Swami's stern reprimand to me, and I narrated that story just to convince you that the human aspect of the avatar was always present, and we have to keep this in mind. As for me, at least at that time, I had to keep it in mind while serving Swami. Okay, let me get back to what I started to do, which is to tell you something about history of India. You know, from ancient times, India always had some contact with Europe. How do I know it? Because historical records talk of contacts with people from various countries in Europe and also on the East, by the way. Centuries before Christ, Alexander the Great even invaded India. As you perhaps know, Alexander came marching all across the Middle East and then crossed into India via today's Afghanistan and the Khyber Pass. So there was definitely a land route, but reaching India with a land route was so arduous, you had to cross so many big mountains, that for centuries thereafter, European traders made no serious effort to come to India. Instead, what they would do was to buy spices from Arab merchants. You see, the Europeans were interested in Indian spices like cloves and so many other things. So they would buy it from the Arabs. Now, how did the Arabs come here? The Arabs came here by sailing across the Arabian Sea. For them, it was very simple. You get into a boat, sail across the Arabian Sea, and land in the southwest part of India, in what is now the state of Kerala. There they would pick up all the spices they want, cashew nuts, cloves, and so many other things, and resell them in Mediterranean countries like Italy, Greece, and so on, for a much higher price. Wanting to avoid Arab middlemen, many countries in Europe then began searching for a sea route to India and the Far East, beyond India. If you recall, Columbus in fact was actually trying to get to India, but by going west, not east. Columbus did not reach India, but landed instead in America. That was in October 1492. A friend of mine often used to say, if only Columbus had landed here, we would have all become Americans. Obviously, that was said in a lighter vein, but the fact remains true that the natives whom Columbus saw in the new continent he had discovered came to be called Indians. And Indians they remain to this day. Well, Columbus discovered America in 1492. But the route to India had not yet been discovered. And so in 1498, a man called Vasco da Gama of Portugal said, I will do what Columbus did not do. And he actually did it. How did he do it? He went around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa and went east and landed on the southwest coast of India, if I am not mistaken, in Calicut. The sea route to India having been discovered, traders from all over Europe then began to flock to the subcontinent. They began to compete with the Arabs. They said, move over, we will go and buy directly. And thus, first came the Portuguese, followed by the Dutch, then the Danes, then the French, and of course the British. They all came to do trading, and trade they did. However, in the process of competing against each other, they also became deeply involved in local political intrigues. By that I mean, India was full of small territories, each ruled by a prince or a Nawab or something like that. And there was always some kind of political friction between these kings and Nawabs. And these fellows who came from Europe began to take sides and meddle in Indian politics, shall I say. In turn, this led to many proxy wars between European competitors. What I mean is, France would say support one king, British would support another king. These two kings will fight. So one fellow will support one king, this fellow will support his king, and these two stooges of France and England would fight. For a while, these proxy wars went on. And these there are many competitors like the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and so on. And the kind of competition that took place depended on the politics in Europe. There would be times when, say, Portuguese and the English are on good terms, then they will join together and they will try to fight against the French and so on. Soon, proxy wars gave way to direct wars. There is one famous example, and that is associated with the direct fight between the French and the British armies of trading companies, not the governments. But British were British, even if they are traders, and the French were French, even if they are traders. And this battle took place in South India at a place called Vandavasi, which the British called Wandiwash. And this is the famous Battle of Wandiwash, where Robert Clive defeated Dupleix. Robert Clive was the representative of the British East India Company, and Dupleix was the Frenchman. And the French were finally defeated in South India, and they more or less disappeared. And their influence later on shrank to very small patches, like Pondicherry, for example. And British became dominant in South India. Now, the story of how the British who came to trade and do business became occupiers is interesting. It all began when about 80 members of the City of London met to form the London East India Company. The company having been formed starting in 1611, the British began to establish a series of trading posts at many places along the coast of the subcontinent, both on the east and the west. At that time, there were actually two rival English trading companies. But in 1708, they merged to form one company called the East India Company, which was popularly referred to as the John Company. Soon, the British realized that trade became much easier if they owned territory. See, they could stick around there and start pushing their products also. The British were not merely buying from here, they were also selling their products here. This was a two-way trade, and they felt it would be easier if they could have big godowns and they could go and canvass for sales. And if they owned the territory, they could thrust it down the local people and literally make them buy it. And so, slowly, in stages, by various means including waging wars, the East India Company acquired control over most of the Indian peninsula from the Arabian Sea to the Bay of Bengal. That was when they moved north and began to conquer large territories everywhere, starting from Calcutta in the east all the way to Punjab and Sindh. The territories of the company, East India Company that is, were divided into provinces, and each province had a governor, and all these governors reported to a Governor General in the capital of British India, which at that time was in Calcutta. Today the capital of India is Delhi, but that happened around 1909 or so, or 1911 I think. Now, although the East India Company was a company, it had borrowed and it had been mortgaged to the British government. Therefore, where ruling was concerned, the actual power was with the British government. Thus, the Governor General, who sort of took care of the territories of the company in India, was actually a political appointee of the British government. So the British were using the company like a puppet. And to consolidate its position, the company did two things. Firstly, it began to recruit Indians to serve as soldiers in its army. See, once you stay in a country for good, at least that's what the British thought they were doing, you needed an army apart from police. Because if somebody else attacks, you have to fight them. And there were wars, plenty of wars. And they couldn't get all the soldiers from England. That would have been very expensive. So they began to recruit from India. And India had many soldiers because every king had soldiers. Every Nawab had soldiers. So wherever they went, the British could recruit soldiers, train them, and induct them into their army. The officers, of course, came from Britain. Next, the company improved communications in the territories that they control. How did they do that? They introduced the telegraph and built railways. Today, most of the young people, if not all, would not know what the telegraph is. Well, back when I was young, the telegraph was the lifeline available for sending messages quickly, and it existed at least 50 years before the telephone came. Those of you who are curious, please go to the Google and find out what the telegraph is. By the way, the telegraph has folded, and the last telegrams have been sent even from India. I remember there was a period when Swami would get telegrams every day, and it was my job to sort them out and then show it to him. By this time, technology had advanced, and so all these telegrams were printed using a line printer in the telegraph office near the bank, State Bank of India. But in the line printer, they had forgotten, the telegraph office had forgotten to change the ribbon. I suppose they had no money to buy a new ribbon. And so nothing was seen. And when I showed the telegram to Swami, he would say, "What is this? I can't see anything." Tear it and throw it. These people have no brains. And apart from the telegraph, the British also built railways, which was a very important contribution they made. Now, the East India Company knew how to do business. After all, they were businessmen. But governing a territory is a much bigger job. And the territory that the British controlled was much bigger than Britain. In fact, as one British engineer said, I didn't know that rivers could be that big. You know, when they came to India, they saw big rivers like the Indus and the Ganges. And in Britain, they have very small rivers. They are used to building bridges across there, across those small rivers. And here in India, they had to build bridges across huge rivers. It was a big challenge for them. Of course, they rose to the occasion. So, governing India was a big problem for the company. It was tough. And they did not have a policy at that time. There were some, like Sir Thomas Munro, who died in India, by the way, and whose statue can still be seen in Chennai. They felt, and in fact Sir Thomas Munro recorded his views, that the natives, as they used to refer to the Indians, ought to be given respect and treated with dignity. Many people said this, including Lord Warren Hastings, who incidentally had a great respect for Indian scriptures, because some of the company staff, Englishmen, translated Indian scriptures into English on their own. They didn't even get paid for it. And Warren Hastings sent them all to the East India Company and said, "These people are doing all these things. They are very poorly paid. You must give them some bonus." And that was how the first English translation of the Bhagavad Gita reached London. So there was Sir Thomas Munro, who said the Indians should be given respect. On the other hand, there was a lord called Lord Cornwallis. He was also the Governor General. He wanted to impose English ideas and institutions on Indian society. That means things should be done as they are done in England, so that it would be beneficial to the company. To put it more simply and perhaps crudely, what Lord Cornwallis wanted was Indians to be trained to work in lower posts in the company. Once again, it was a question of economics. If you had to import all clerks from England, it would cost a lot. If you could recruit clerks locally, then that would be much better. But then, to work in the company, the clerks had to know English, which means they had to study English in schools. Now, there was a man called Lord Macaulay who was in India at that time as a company official, and he seized upon this idea of Cornwallis and around 1830 or so introduced the English system of education in India. That is to say, the schools in India began to teach subjects like the schools in England. That system of education introduced by Macaulay changed India's density. That system of education introduced by Macaulay changed India's destiny. And in a sense, that system remains to this day. Now, the British had seized power, and with power came arrogance. Thus, while many statutes enacted by the company were beneficial to the people, there were also many that angered the public. One thing led to another, and one fine day, around late 1857, I think, the Indian soldiers in the army of the East India Company rose in mutiny. This was called the Sepoy Mutiny. Sepoy was the name given for the soldier with the British. And this Sepoy Mutiny, as the British still refer to it, rapidly became a very widespread war, with many Indian rulers also joining in. They were not directly under the control of the British, but they detested the British because the British were interfering in their states too much. So it became a widespread war. The war was mostly confined to the north. There was very little of this Sepoy Mutiny in the south. But where the wars were fought, they were extensive and very brutal and bloody. Eventually, the East India Company got the upper hand. In the beginning they were losing, but eventually they got the upper hand. And on July 8, 1858, the then Governor General Lord Canning proclaimed peace. At this stage, the British government in London decided to intervene. They passed an act in the British Parliament and took over the colonies from the company and became direct rulers. They said, why should we have a proxy ruler? We will rule ourselves. And so in 1858, India came directly under the British crown. And thus began the official British Raj. The Governor General continued to remain Governor General, but since he was now representing the monarch of Britain, he was given a new title, and that is the Viceroy. Viceroy means in place of the king. So the Governor General had two titles. One is Governor General and Viceroy. That dual post came after the British took over India in 1858. As Governor General, he was King of India. He could do anything. But as Viceroy, he had to report to the Secretary of State in the British Cabinet and take orders from him. That is the way it was. And the British, who took control in 1858, stayed till 1947, when they transferred power to India and left for good. Before I come to that, I must say a few words about the official British Raj, because Swami grew up under the Raj when India was very different, and so was life in the village. I can speak from personal knowledge because I have seen what India was in the 30s and 40s. When the rulership passed from the company to the crown, India was a patchwork of territories, some of which, like the provinces, were directly controlled by the British, and the rest was under various local rulers of various types, such as Maharajas and Nawabs. There were hundreds of these so-called Indian states, and they also varied considerably in size. And some of the largest Indian states were actually bigger than some of the countries of Europe, while the smallest Indian states were just a couple of 100 acres. You might recall I referred to Sandur and Chincholi. Maybe I didn't refer to Venkatagiri. If I did not, it will come shortly. Sandur, Chincholi, Venkatagiri all had Rajas, but their estates were relatively small. On the other hand, Mysore, which was one of the very big states and had a big Raja, the Maharani of Mysore also used to come to Swami. Now I am referring to Mysore for a very specific reason. If you take the size of Mysore as it existed then, I am sure it was much bigger than Holland or Netherlands as it's called, Belgium, Denmark, and so on. Most of the states, there are about 500 odd, were in North India, in what is now known as Rajasthan and Saurashtra. And the big states included Jammu and Kashmir in the north and Hyderabad, Mysore and Trivandrum in the south. Britain did not want to take direct charge of the states, for that would mean more wars and more bloodshed and so on. Moreover, if those states directly came under the crown, it would need a much bigger British army to maintain control. By the way, the company army was now replaced by the British army, British Indian Army as it was called. It also had sepoys and soldiers. It had many regiments, but all the officers came from Britain. So, how did the British deal with the Indian princes? Very tactfully, they entered into an agreement with every one of the states, whereby the ruler of an Indian state would share his sovereignty with the British. So the Indian prince would say, "These are all my powers. I will give away all these powers to you, and in return, you protect me." So in this manner, the British managed to take away the sovereignty, so part of the sovereignty of the Indian states, and instead comforted them by saying, "Don't worry, if anybody attacks you, I will protect you." And Britain became the paramount power. This principle of sharing sovereignty was called the paramountcy principle. And Britain also sweetened the deal by not only offering military protection but extending the courtesy to princely states and giving them royal status according to rank, of course. For example, the head of a big state would be given more what you call royal treatment than the head of a small state. In fact, the rank of a state was determined by the number of guns fired as a salute. And in later years, only those rulers entitled to a salute of 11 guns or more were accorded really princely treatment, and the heads of those states or princes were referred to as His Highness. Thus the Maharaja of Mysore used to be referred to as His Highness the Maharaja of Mysore. But actually he was so huge and big, people used to refer to him as His Heaviness. So, all that was still the British ruled India. After partition, about which I shall speak shortly, what emerged as today's India had about 500 princely states. And bringing them back into the Indian Union, not back, bringing them into the Indian Union required a lot of protracted discussion and strategy and was eventually achieved. You see, the British were very clearly left India telling the princess, "Goodbye, we are leaving. Our agreement with you stops from today. You do what you want. If you want to be independent, you be independent, but you have to fight your own wars. If you want to join India, you can join India. If you want to join Pakistan, you can join Pakistan." And there was a big problem. because these states are scattered all over the place. Some are big, some are large, small. And India could not just go on fighting with its own people and conquering them. So there was a lot of protracted discussion, and eventually the princes all agreed to accede to India and be under the protection of the Indian Union. Eventually, those states were all integrated with the Indian Union, and all the princes were left with were their titles and a privy purse, which also has today gone. So today, all the princely states have disappeared. Now, let me get back to the introduction of the British regime. That is the transition of power from the company to the British government. As I told you, it happened in 1858. And after that happened, there was peace, no wars for a long time, and also a foundation for a strong centralized government in India. Government believed in ruling, and they began to rule India like they were ruling in England, of course, without any democracy. That's for sure. In 1877, Queen Victoria declared herself to be the Empress of India. So that means India was now a part of the British Empire. Till then, Britain did not call itself an empire. But once Queen Victoria declared herself to be the Empress of India, not the Queen of India, the British regime, or rather, it had colonies everywhere, Australia, Canada, and so on. That entire setup came to be known as the British Empire. And India was the crown jewel of the British Empire. Now, the centralized government, which means that power was controlled largely by the Governor General, led to a lot of improvement as compared to the company Raj. The crown also became an instrument of oppression and repression, both of which produced a strong counter-reaction in the form of Indian nationalism. Now, several factors contributed to this rise of Indian nationalism, and believe it or not, prominent among this was Macaulay's educational system. If you remember, Macaulay introduced English medium mainly to train clerks for the company Raj. But once the Indians began to go to school and learn English, they also went to the library and began to read books. As a result, Indians began to get exposed to all kinds of knowledge that was available in the West, including political philosophy. And slowly, Indians began to become politically conscious in increasing numbers. In addition, thanks to education, many Indians became employees in the British government. The government was one of the biggest employers, and they also joined the railways, the postal service, and so on. And that was what you call a reasonable middle class. And slowly, they too began playing their own role in the demand for freedom. Added to all this was the press. Initially, it was the British who established and ran newspapers in India, but soon Indians also began doing the same. And the Indians published newspapers not only in English as the British did, but also in various Indian languages. And you know, the press can influence public opinion. Meanwhile, thanks to the railways, newspapers could be distributed outside the towns in which they were printed. I remember there's still today a newspaper called the Hindu, which is published from Madras. In those days, it was published and printed in Madras. Today, of course, it's published from Madras but printed in many parts of the country. It has many editions, Delhi edition, Hyderabad edition, and so on. And that paper is more than 100 years old. And there would be two editions of the newspaper, one of which would be printed by 5 o'clock in the evening, and it would then be, the papers would then be packed I've seen this myself, and taken to the big railway station in the city of Madras and put into different trains which would take them to towns in the south. Next morning, the city will get what is called the city edition. So they will have slightly more updated news. And in other words, the railways and the telegraph allowed people to communicate more easily, also the postal system. And all this led to a growth of national consciousness or political fervor. What added fuel to fire were the many acts of repression. The British passed many outrageous laws. One of them was called the Rowlatt Act, and that was really brutal. And apart from that, they fought many wars, especially in Afghanistan. Today, you all know that there is a war in Afghanistan that has been going on for nearly 10 years, and before that there was the Soviet occupation. But the first people to mess around in Afghanistan were the British. From 1858, when they first took control of India, the British fought many wars in Afghanistan, and they more or less lost all of them. But who did the fighting? Indian soldiers. And as a result of that, the Indian economy was drained. By the way, one such war which was fought in 1897, it was actually fought in the northwest part of India at that time, in a place called Swat Valley, which is now in Pakistan. There was a British soldier there who also spent some time in the city of Bangalore. But this soldier also worked as a war correspondent for a British newspaper. And that man was none other than Winston Churchill. Another interesting tidbit relating to the Afghan wars is, if you have read Sherlock Holmes, you would know that he had a companion called Dr. Watson. This Dr. Watson was actually a Afghan war veteran, and he was in fact injured in that war. Later on, he went back to England and he wanted a friend to live with, and he came and struck a friendship with Holmes and lived with him till he got married. That's an interesting side story about the Afghan wars. But I mentioned the Afghan wars because all these indiscriminate wars were not only fruitless expeditions, but they were also financially disastrous because it exhausted the Indian treasury. In other words, the British India government became literally broke. And this severely affected the Indian economy and led to extreme poverty, as a result of which there were periodic famines. You see, if the government is broke, there is less employment and there is less money circulating, and millions starved because they did not have money to buy food. Millions. And they died in millions. I still remember the last such major starvation that happened in 1943 in Bengal, when over 1 to 2 million people died. 1 to 2 million people died in the villages of Bengal, simply because they did not have money to buy food. It is not that there was no food. There was food. In Calcutta, people had money, so they bought food. Villages, they had no money, so they could not buy food, and they starved to death. I remember about this very well because as schoolboys, we were all asked to go and collect donations. We were asked by our school, we would collect donations, give them some ticket, receipt and all that, and give it to the teacher, who would then give the money to the authorities upstairs, and it was called the Bengal Famine Relief Fund. Apart from all this, there was blatant racial discrimination. In the sense, the British favored the British when it came to appointment to senior posts. They did not allow Indians to occupy senior posts till the very end. And so there was what you call a lot of resentment and some kind of rebellion brewing. And The whole nationalistic movement took a sharp turn in 1955 when Mahatma Gandhi returned from South Africa to India. He had gone to South Africa somewhere in the late 1890s to work as an attorney in Johannesburg. After his experiences there, he finally said, let me go back to India, and he came in 1955. When he landed, the nationalist movement was sort of getting ready to boil, and he jumped into it. And he gave it a completely different twist. Gandhi was concerned about the future of India, no doubt, but not merely the political future of India. He was deeply shaped by his philosophy and convictions, and all his methods were deeply rooted in non-negotiable moral values handed down from ancient times. More than anything else, in the midst of all his various political preoccupations, Gandhi was always focused on the poor of India, irrespective of their religion and caste. I am mentioning this because Swami also was doing the same. He was always focused on the poor of India. What always pained Gandhi was the suffering of others. That also applied to Swami. Now, as the political fervor grew, the British became very nervous. They knew that one day or the other they would have to quit India and transfer power to the people, but they wanted to prolong their stay as much as possible. And they did it by playing a divide and rule game. It was at that time a smart lawyer from Bombay named Muhammad Ali Jinnah took full advantage of the divide and rule policy of the British. Jinnah was a Muslim by birth, but he disliked Muslim orthodoxy. In fact, he was very much British in his style of living. Yet, he founded a party called the Muslim League and found that the Muslim identity was a shrewd card to play where politics was concerned. In effect, what Jinnah began saying to the British was that if they left India, then the Muslims of British India would not be safe, and they must therefore be given their own homeland. Meanwhile, World War II broke out in 1939, and the independence movement was promptly curbed by the British government in India on orders from England by invoking emergency powers. As a result of that, most of the leaders of the national movement were arrested and thrown in jail. Of course, Jinnah did not go to jail because he was not doing any agitation. He was only giving strong, virulent lectures and mobilizing the Muslims, which suited the British. Gandhi actually met the Viceroy, Lord Lilithgow at that time, and I remember this meeting took place in Simla. I was in Simla at that time, but I did not see the Mahatma. And what the Viceroy said was, there cannot be any talk whatsoever now of independence. After the war, maybe. One fine day, the war also ended. And there was also a general election in Britain. And believe it or not, Churchill, who was the war hero, was voted out. He was the war hero and the Prime Minister of the wartime cabinet in England. But after the war was over in 1946 or so, when there was a general election, Churchill was voted out, and the Labour Party swept the polls, and Clement Attlee became the Prime Minister. Now, Attlee quickly realized that Britain was broke. It had to fight a war, world war, on many fronts, and it had no money. And it had no money even to run its own government. How could it maintain a big empire? They decided that the smart thing to do was to let all colonies become free. In other words, they said, let us get rid of this empire, which is now a millstone around the neck. And Attlee decided to start with India. In other words, he said to Indians, it's time for you to become independent. I am going to give you independence. That was when Jinnah's communal cry became very shrill, and he started demanding very vigorously and vociferously that before they left, the British must ensure a homeland for the Muslims of the subcontinent. There were any number of talks between Jinnah and Gandhi, between Jinnah, Gandhi and the Viceroy and Gandhi, Viceroy and Jinnah. By this time, there was a new Viceroy, Lord Mountbatten. All that was of no avail. Most people in India, including the Muslims, wanted one India at the time of independence. But Jinnah said, you partition this country into two countries. Gandhi was totally opposed to partition because it went against everything he stood for. But Jinnah was so adamant that partition had to be eventually agreed to by almost all, including those who had dreamt of one India. Gandhi was severely alone, and on Independence Day, he was nowhere near Delhi, where the celebrations were taking place. Where was Gandhi? He was in a faraway place in Bengal. Why did he go there? I'll tell you now. You see, given the huge buildup of communal tension means tension between the Hindus or the majority and the Muslims or the principal minority. Given that tension that had been built up and risen to very great heights, when partition finally came, a large number of Muslims in India wanted to go to Pakistan, and a large number of Hindus in what was Pakistan wanted to come to India. Lahore, which is in Pakistan, had lots of Hindus. They all wanted to come to this side and people wanted to go to that side. In all this, there was a lot of what you call rioting and brutal murder. A murder which consumed about 1 million people. Now this mass killing was not the result of a war between two powerful armies. It was not India and Pakistan fighting. Sadly, it was just ordinary people killing each other in blind rage that drove them to temporary madness. I don't know whether it is still available. There was a book at that time, a very powerful book written by an Indian journalist named Kushwant Singh, trained from Pakistan or trained from Lahore, I think it was called. Anyway, those communal riots were an important lesson to humanity that whipping up passion through extreme inflammatory rhetoric could have dangerous consequences. But sadly, humanity does not appear to have learned that lesson, and it's not clear to me that it ever will, because such rhetoric continues to this day. So as I told you, Gandhi was not in Delhi, he was in Naukali, a place in what is now Bangladesh, trying to console the victims of communal riots. There's a very famous photograph of Gandhi walking through rice fields, held by a few people, trying to meet people there. He was totally shattered. He tried his best to promote communal harmony in India, but in the charged atmosphere that prevailed at that time, very few heard his pleas. Eventually, Gandhi also fell to an assassin's bullet. That happened on 30th January 1948. Mercifully, with the passage of time and the rise of new generation, partition has become somewhat of a dim memory. Following independence, India became a secular democratic republic guaranteeing religious freedom to all. You can be a Sikh, a Jain, a Muslim, a Parsi, any religion, they didn't care. While Pakistan declared itself an Islamic republic. Now interestingly, despite the partition, India has today more Muslims than Pakistan. In a sense, that reflects the tradition of India. The Prime Minister of India, Dr. Manmohan Singh, He's not a Hindu, he's a Sikh. Actually, he came from Pakistan. That is to say, his parents came from Pakistan. And it is said that when he went to America at the time of George W. Bush, George W. Bush, then president, introduced Dr. Manmohan Singh to his wife, saying, "Honey, this gentleman is the Prime Minister of India. There are 150 million Muslims in that country and no Al Qaeda." That's the way he praised Dr. Singh and India. I know that many of you who are focused entirely on Swami might be irritated by the digression that I am giving. By this digression, I have entered to today, giving you a piece of Indian history. I have taken the liberty of doing this for two reasons. The first is these videos that are being recorded would become a part of our archives. And I am sure at least some people will see them, say 50 or 100 years from now. Most people at that time would know hardly anything about all that I have been telling you. And yet this history which I have narrated in a capsule form is relevant in the context of Swami's story at the human level for a number of reasons. I wish to reiterate once again that avatars like Rama, Krishna, Shirdi Baba and our own Swami lived like humans and gave their message at our wavelength. It is in that context that this digression of mine becomes important. I personally feel so, having lived through World War II in the partition days, and I know what sort of conditions existed when Swami grew up, came to Pathamandiram and came to the new mandir. For example, back then we did not have electricity. When I wrote my school final examination, I had to study by a kerosene lamp. We had no electricity in our house. There was no telephone in the place where I lived. And there was only a public radio in the park that was established even during British time. And those radios were operated by battery. So if you want to hear news or anything, you go to the park, and they had set times in the evening, 5 to 7. I used to go there, listen to news and things like that. Let me get back to Swami. Now, if you view against the developments I have described at length, the life of Swami, then the following facts stand out. Actually, India was two nations in one country. I'm not talking of Hindus and Muslims. I'm talking of the nation of the poor and the nation of the middle class. The nation of the poor was about 80% of the population. It was rural India. And the nation of the middle class was the remaining 20% scattered in the cities. In 1930s, it was 90-10. And rural India included not only Hindus, but also Muslims and Sikhs. Rural India was very poor, but it was rural India that fed the entire country. And in British days, quite a bit of their revenue came from rural India because the British very smartly taxed agricultural produce. Back then, the district collector would go around villages and actually collect tax. It used to be called Jamabandi. Even so, the people in the cities who were smaller in number had a louder voice, as a result of which few bothered about the problems of rural India. And that continues to remain the case even to this day to a large extent. Swami understood the problems of rural India and also that standard education would not train people to solve these problems. He knew India was going to become independent. He knew the Indians would take power, and he knew that these Indians had been trained not to solve problems. They wouldn't know how to solve problems. They won't even properly understand what these problems are like. The type of education that Macaulay introduced might help students to gain worldly knowledge, but did little to promote the spirit of compassion. It is perhaps to make a statement about that Swami dropped out of school, as if to say, this education is useless. What good does it do to me? I can do more for this country without this education than by going through all this school. Later I shall describe some of the many projects that Swami did for the needy and the poor. You will find that in every case, that is to say, every project that Swami did, mega project, there was a mixture of knowledge and compassion. Knowledge came from your school education, but compassion did not come from school, it came from the heart. That was the very interesting blend that Swami brought to this country when the time was ripe. And time was ripe for him to act, I mean. The hospitals of Swami provide a classic example. You go and take a look, you will see the latest equipment. Thus the knowledge component is present in the hospital in full measure. And so it is in many of the profit hospitals in the country, Apollo hospitals and so on. There are so many. But how many of these big hospitals in the cities would treat the poor? Not one. Not one. As far as these hospitals are concerned, if you go there with no money, it means no treatment. If the patient has to die as a result, that's unfortunate. Maybe it's karma. We can't do anything. That is their policy and they make no secret of it. In Swami's hospitals, there is knowledge from the hospital administration side and there is compassion and service from the staff side. How come? Because Swami knows the problems of the poor inside out. Having lived amidst the poor, having been born poor, he knows all about it, whether it is concerned with education or health or drinking water. That's why he set up a free university and free school. That's why he set up free hospital. And that's why he did so many drinking water projects. Now, all the years up to 1947, he was silent, just like a witness to history. He knew that India would become independent. And he knew that in independent India also the rural areas would be neglected. And he knew that because of red tape and bureaucracy and apathy, when projects are done for the poor, they would not be done properly. Hospitals will be third rate, drinking water projects will not work. That is if anybody bothered about the poor. He knew all that. On the other hand, whenever Swami did a project, he always said, people are suffering and I must do something to remove their suffering. In other words, in every project that Swami did, there was a top-down approach in terms of project planning, etc. But there was also a bottomed-up approach which made sure that the interests of the beneficiaries were duly taken care of. Very often this bottom-up approach is missing. In the rare case it is there in projects executed by NGOs and governments, for example. They go entirely in different directions. The top-down will come like this, the bottom approach will go like this. Project ends as a failure. In Swami's case, these two always converge, and this was true of every project that Swami did. I'll talk about this later. In simple terms, Swami always wanted to make sure at the end of the day, the project makes a difference to the beneficiaries and that they are happy. Everything he did, he wanted to make sure that they are happy. Let me give you a simple example of how costly projects can go awry. Relocation of slum dwellers provides a classic example. Big slums are pretty common in all developing countries, India included of course, and in all countries there have been projects to relocate slum dwellers. Incidentally, these slums are found only in big cities. Why? Because cities need a lot of low-paid labor. And who will go offer that labor? Only people who migrate from villages looking for low-paid jobs, something so that they can eat. They have no place to live, so they create slums. Let me consider examples of two countries, Brazil and Cambodia. They are very far from each other. In both countries, projects were done to relocate slum dwellers and clean up a major city. In other words, the slum dwellers were told, don't stay in the slum, it is bad for you, it is also making the city ugly, we will build nice buildings, we'll take you there, you will have a nice house, electricity, this, that. We will do it all for you, cooperate with us. Now, part of the reason why suddenly the governments of these cities wanted to be so charitable was to make the city more attractive to tourists. So there was an element of selfishness or swartham, as Swami would say. So in Brazil, they built a slum. They tried to take the slum dwellers to the new dwelling. They were unhappy. And in Cambodia also it happened, same way. How come in both cases they failed? Because in both places they failed to take account an important aspect of the life of a slum dweller. See, this is where project planners fail, because they forget to talk to the people for whom they are doing the project. What happened in this case? As I told you, slums grow in big cities because the rich want cheap labor. Now, when you give nice houses to the slum dwellers, they refuse to move because this resettlement is far away from the jobs. In Cambodia, they said, these houses are nice, but there are no jobs here. If you have to go for jobs, you have to go to Phnom Penh, which is the capital. That is 20 kilometers away from here. And we have to take buses and all that. It takes time and it is costly. And if you get a job there, half our money is lost in transport. We know the slums are very inconvenient, but the job was just next door. You give us job here. The government said, no, your housing was bad, we have given you housing. Job is your problem. So what happens at the end of the day? The government spends money and the people continue to remain unhappy. There is no satisfaction. It's a loss for the slum dwellers. It's a loss for the government. It's a lose-lose result after spending a lot of money. It is this habit of doing projects without giving even the slightest consideration to the what you call the feelings of people who are going to be the beneficiaries that ruins most projects. It happens regularly all over the world. Many World Bank projects, IMF funded projects done in third world countries fail. I will talk about this later. There is one other point I would like to draw attention to. Today there are any number of NGOs all over the world. Among these, the Red Cross is supposed to have the best record with almost no corruption. That's very good. Now, let's ask a question. Supposing the Red Cross spends $1 on a project. This dollar is allotted to a particular project. How much of that project actually reaches the beneficiaries? This is a standard question that is asked. In the case of the Red Cross, it is said to be 50 cents. What happens to the remaining 50 cents? Is it swallowed? Is it lost in corruption? No. Red Cross don't allow all that. Then where does the money go? The money is used up by the Red Cross in meeting what are called overhead expenses. Running a big office, transport expenses for the office officials who go to inspect projects, their hotel expenses, and so on. Now, very few people know that in Swami's projects, 90 to 95% of the funds allocated translates as actual benefits. Why? Because the overheads are unbelievably low. There is no project in the world I know of where the overheads are so ridiculously low. Very few people have taken notice of this, and even fewer still talk about it. In this country, hardly anyone knows. One more point. Take a look at a map of India and locate the East Godavari district of Andhra Pradesh there. You can do it on the Google or anywhere. Go to Atlas and take a look. You may not know it. There is a tribal region in East Godavari district on the northern side of the district. Just to the north of this tribal region of East Godavari, there is another tribal region but in a different state. That state happens to be called Chhattisgarh. Now, why am I mentioning this? Because in the tribal region of East Godavari, there is no tribal unrest and insurgency. Whereas in the neighboring region, there is a lot of trouble. How come? This issue has not been examined at all. In fact, I have not heard anyone ask this question. But if you think about it, you will realize something very striking. You see, in East Godavari, Swami has done a very big water project for the tribals. They did not have safe drinking water till then, but today they have. That is one good benefit. And the Sri Sathya Sai Seva organization has been doing a very special intensive village integrated program which they call VIP program for at least 4 years now in that region. They do it in many places, but in this region they do it with a lot of intensity. So the tribals find that someone is coming, talking to them once in a while, helping them, and has made them feel confident that there are people who are willing to take time off and do good to them, who are willing to try and help them, who are willing to make effort in order to make them happy. That is very important. And if people feel neglected, uncared for, as is happening in the northern district to the north of East Godavari, then after a while they can take it no more and there are all kinds of problems. And today there is a lot of insurgency in India. It did not suddenly come out of nowhere. It comes out of indifference and neglect. That Swami was aware of because he lived in a village and he knew what indifference meant. So he said, I will show people how to look after other people who feel neglected and uncared for. But how many people pay attention to these aspects of Swami's life? I would request you to think about it. I apologize again if I have disappointed many of you with this talk. But speaking for myself, I have no regrets. My task is to point out those aspects of Swami's life that have a real message but receive little notice. I hope that at least some of you would agree with my view and the account that I have given you today. I thank you for your patience, and before I sign off, I have to make a small announcement. I don't know when this will be broadcast and when you will see it on the website, this video. But next week will be the Aradhana week, the first anniversary of the Mahasamadhi. And I have got some involvement with that function, so it will be difficult for me to take time off and record the next episode. So you will have to bear with me if I skip 1 week and join you the week after next. Meanwhile, I thank you again. God bless you and Jai Sai Ram. And as always, I would like to conclude by offering this talk to Swami. Sai Ram.